And I remember stopping and sitting there in the room with him and saying, God, why? Why? My name is Walter Maddux, and this is my story. I'm originally from here. I was born in Denver, but raised here in Pueblo. Don't really have much memories of my time in Denver. My parents moved here when I was very young. My father, originally from Alamosa, where he grew up on a family ranch that my great-great-grandfather established back in 1874. He was one of the first settlers down there in the San Luis Valley. My mother, she was born and raised here in Pueblo. Folks who have attended this church for any length of time will probably know my grandparents. They would know them as Papa Phil and Pearl Janetta. My grandma and grandpa Janetta were a part of this church. They were originally going to First Assembly over at 702 North Main Street, where my grandfather was on the board, and my grandmother was very involved in the church, and she made sure that the kids were raised, their children were raised in the church. So when I was born, my mother, ensured that, that we were raised in the church as well. My first memories are of, running up and down the hallways there at First Assembly. I spent time in the nursery, downstairs that old church there on Main Street. Time spent in children's church and Sunday school. Really good times over there, playing on the stairs out front, sliding down that railing down the front. But good times, and just very blessed to have been raised, in the church like that, and to have an example, with my grandparents, my grandfather again, who was, Phil Janetta, who was on the board for the church, and he was actually on the board when they originally came up with the concept of the church here, of the Pueblo Christian Center. And I remember when they brought us here with the groundbreaking ceremony of this church. I remember those days of being here in the prairie and dedicating the ground and breaking the soil of this church. So as a kid, my mother had me, here every Sunday. We were here every Wednesday night. I did the Royal Ranger thing. And so, just very blessed to have that kind of upbringing from my young years. On the other side of the coin, every story has two sides, was my father. He, initially when we were going to First Assembly, he was going there with us, and he was a part of the church, but it was one of those things where he was more kind of forced into kind of going to the church. He didn't really want to, I believe, be part of the church, because later on he used to tell us, your mother made me go to church. So I found out early on as a kid that my father was a very violent man. He had a lot of anger and stuff. He was into electronics. He was an electronic technician, knew electronics very well. He was very big into CB, ham radio operators in the day. We had the car with the ham operator license plate and the big antenna. And I remember as a little kid, he had a little workshop a little workbench where he would work on all his electronics. He'd have stuff tore apart and electronic components, resistors, transistors laying all over the place, and he'd work on them. But also in the backyard, he had a very large antenna. And so it was April 1st one year, and this is one of the first clear memories I have, was I decided I was going to play an April Fool joke on him. And I told my mother about it. I said, Mom, I'm going to do this to Dad. I'm going to fake him out. And so what I did is I went down to his shop where he was working on his radios, and I told him, I said, Dad, and I played it up really well. I'm really sorry. I was out in the backyard playing, and I tripped and I fell, and and I knocked over your antenna. And before I could say April Fool or anything like that, he had snatched me up off the ground and just commenced to beat on me. And he grabbed the closest thing, which happened to be a ruler, and just wailed on me relentlessly. And I remember my mother coming down and getting after him, and hollering at him and telling him, it was just an April Fool joke. It was just an April Fool joke. And he tried to apologize later on, but that was just kind of prevalent. I remember much of my growing up time with him was he was very abusive, and you didn't think about it at the time, but he was one of those guys that he believed in very harsh punishment, and he used to actually keep a leather belt that hung on the back of the bedroom door, and the sole purpose of this leather belt was to beat us with. And he used to even actually, when we would get in trouble for whatever, he would actually make us go get the belt. He'd tell us, go get the belt. And we'd have to walk to the room and get the leather belt and bring it to him and hand it to him. And then he would sit there and he would just pop it and make this cracking noise to intimidate us. And I'm not just talking spanking. I mean, to where we were bruised and welted. And especially, and if you didn't hold still, he hit you in the middle of your back. He'd hit you on the back of your legs. But the abuse was pretty extreme with him. And I remember as a kid growing up that he and my mother used to fight a lot. And I remember him leaving the house in fits of rage, and my mother just sitting there sobbing and crying, and very difficult, for a young man to watch that and to experience that. And so another thing that he used to do, and this is another clear memory I could never forget, is he used to tickle us, and you'd think, oh, tickling is funny, but he would do it to a point that you'd be just like, stop, and he would get joy. He would laugh at our discomfort to the point that he would try to tickle us till where we would wet ourselves, and it was more of a something dominant, where he would dominate us. And I remember at one point I was starting to get a little bit older, and I got to a point where he started to do it, and I told him stop it, and he wouldn't stop. And so I reared back and punched him. I hit him as hard as I could, right in the nose too. And I gave him a bloody nose. And I remember he threw me to the ground, and here I am. I'm still a small child, and he sat in the middle of my chest, and he sat there and just stared at me, and the anger and the rage that was in his eyes as he sat there. And I'll never to this day forget that feeling of that blood dripping from his nose and hitting on my t-shirt in the middle of my chest. And then he says, oh, you think that's funny? And I remember he drew his fist back because he had me pinned to the floor, and he was going to hit me as hard as he could. And thank God for my mother. She stepped up, and I remember she grabbed him by the hair and she pulled his hair back as she cocked her fist back, and she said, you get off my son. And, it was quite frightening. But it was the first time I had really stood up for myself to him. And things seemed to really go very south from there. Their marriage got worse. And, it wasn't much long after that my mother found out that he was cheating on her. And so they ended up getting divorced. And so at that point, I remember him kind of leaving, saying, well, you're the man of the house now. And, and him leaving, packing his bags and moving out of the house. So, And my mother, well, again, she was the one that she brought me to church constantly. We spent time, we prayed together. I remember sitting in this church singing and praying with her, and then I remember at nights coming home and seeing her just sobbing and crying. And by this time I had 2 younger siblings. I had a younger sister who was 2 years younger than me, and a brother that was 5 years younger. And so me being the oldest, I felt compelled, to be the man of the house and, try to take care of my mother and my 2 younger siblings. Of course, at the time, I was only like, 10 or, I was maybe not even that, 8 or 9, somewhere in that neighborhood. But, it's a lot for an 9-year-old kid to kind of just have that feeling of, and so we started visiting and going over and seeing my dad, and his new, he'd moved in with this lady he'd been having an affair with, who ended up later on becoming my stepmother. She had a young daughter who, again, in retrospect, found out later on was my half sister. Anyway, it was about that time, my mother was still, bringing us here to church, and, my family, my grandma, grandpa, Janetta, my aunts that were here, my Aunt Nadine, my Aunt Nancy, my Aunt Marietta, they were all just so loving to us and helped support my mom through this difficult time. It was amazing to have in a family like that, not just, an immediate family, but the church family and the support that, the Christian Center gave us during that tough time. I remember as a kid, it was just horrible because my mother worked and did whatever she could to support us. But even then, I remember as a kid, I used to hate we were on food stamps, and I used to hate having to go to the loaf and jug and get candy with a food stamp because we had the old paper food stamps, and you felt just terrible about it. But it was about that time that it came time for summer camp here at church, and the kids were going to Horn Creek, and I got sponsored, and I went to Horn Creek, and I remember looking forward to it very much. I was excited. I was, for me it was a relief to kind of get away from the life I'd been living, and to go up to the mountain with the youth here at the church, and man, we had such a great time, and I know Pastor Tony talks about it, and it's been talked about, but the truth of Horn Creek is so real. And it was up there at that summer camp that I came to give my life to the Lord, and I just remember just feeling the Spirit of God upon that place, and just the anointing of the Spirit there, and it was so wonderful being up on that mountain, and it was one of those things where I never wanted to come down. I was happy, and I just being there and being surrounded by that much love, and accepting Christ into my life. I remember coming down off that mountain, and I felt like $1 million, and though I'd grown up in the church, this was the first time I had hit that age, and it hit home for me. And I remember the Lord speaking to my heart. And so I came back down here, and I was feeling good, and I was very happy, and I was still super involved with the church. And then my mother at some point started actually dating again. And at first I was okay with her dating, and and then my mother, my dad ended up getting remarried, and it was life had seemed to kind of find a balance again. But then the time came, and my mother ended up remarrying. And funny, she didn't marry the man I wanted. And it's kind of funny as a kid. It's like, no, I like this boyfriend, Mom. And of course, she did marry the one that I wanted. But I had been, I'd kind of been in that man role for the while, the man of the house, and now, this man had moved into our home, and I was okay with him being a boyfriend. But when they married, I kind of took resentment to it, and I started to become very, very angry about him being there. And it wasn't until later on that I realized, looking back, that I had come from a very abusive, very controlling father, and my mother, of course, was as abused. Both, she was verbally and physically abused just as well. And so when she remarried, my stepfather was not allowed to lay a hand on us. There was no discipline that was to be dished out, and that was because my father obviously didn't use discipline. He used punishment. He used abuse, but that still carried that stigma with it. And so punishment, any kind of physical punishment wasn't allowed. And of course now I'm hitting my teenage years, and all of a sudden I started getting angry, because there was one point in time which, I was trying to tell my brother and sister what to do, because I had been used to, kind of being the man of the house. And he steps up in there. He says, "This isn't your place. This is mine now. I'm the dad here." And I remember that so clear, and I got very angry again at that point. I was very mad. It was like, how dare you come into my house and tell me what to do? And so from that point on, I started kind of a downward kind of a trend. Unfortunately, I started to just resent everything about him. I started resenting their relationship. And when I found out that he couldn't touch me, I was like, you can't touch me. Oh, you can holler at me all you want, but you can't touch me. And for my kid that was used to getting, beaten the way I did, holler at me all you want, you can't touch me. And I became a very much a brat, where I did what I wanted. And I started to push the limit, to push the envelope. And in retrospect now, as an adult looking back, I was wanting the boundaries. I was wanting the boundaries set, because I was looking for that love. I was looking for that love, and I was looking for those boundaries. But because of the abuse, because of the violence that had happened, nobody had set boundaries. And so here I found myself with no boundaries. I found myself this young teenage boy who had, they set rules, but there was no enforcement of the rules. So I could pretty much do whatever I wanted. And so at that point, I started hanging out with some guys that weren't the best influence. I had hit high school and, started drinking, and and I kind of fell out of the church. I got to that point of, I can do what I want. You can't make me go to church anymore. And what are you going to do? And I really became this very angry child that needed to be put in his place, but properly put in his place. But nobody wanted to put me in my place at that point in time. And so I kept pushing the boundaries to see what I could get away with. And this went all the way up into where I was a senior in high school. It was about this time also that I started watching that show Emergency on television back in the mid-'70s, of the firefighters, Johnny and Roy and Engine 51. And I fell in love with the thought of becoming a paramedic firefighter. And I thought, man, wouldn't that be cool? And so I got involved in the ROTC in high school. And I think, again, I was kind of looking for that discipline. I was looking for somebody that would put me in line and would check me. And so I enjoyed the military, because you had the strict rules, and your sergeant would get in your face and stuff. And but on the same hand, I was still at home. I would go to school and and I would perform for the drill team or color guard, and do honors. I became a captain, and but then I would go out and hang with my friends, and and I actually started using tobacco. Initially, I was chewing because all the guys did it, and so I was, drinking beer and chewing, and then I met a girl my senior year, and she was pretty promiscuous, and we started hanging out. And of course, like I said, I was a teenage boy. I was into the drugs, not drugs at this point. I was into alcohol and smoking and pornography. And so when I started dating this young girl who was kind of promiscuous, I ended up having my first sexual encounter with this young lady, and she became my girlfriend. I used to go spend the nights at her house, and again, I kept pushing that limit, and I know I put my mother at her wit's end. She didn't know what to do with me, and I remember it went all the way up to my senior year, and then at that point, I was getting ready to go into the military because being an ROTC, we had the recruiters come and say, "Hey, you want to join the U.S. Army?" And I took the ASVAB test because I'm like, yeah, I'm ready to, blow this popsicle stand. I'm ready to leave and go do my own thing because I'm tired of being in this house. And I knew I caused my mother a lot of stress over that time period. But I did very well on the ASVAB test. And initially I was going to either go in and be a combat medic, or I was going to be a combat engineer. I was either going to be saving lives or driving big trucks. I was a young man. But the recruiter, like a used car salesman, talked me into going into military intelligence, which I did. I took a position as a intelligence analyst, which at 17 years old, it sounded like a pretty cool thing. And it was a good thing I left for the military at that point in time, because just before graduation, I remember I was supposed to be somewhere, and I remember my stepdad came down to the school to find me. And I remember he come down, he said, he come at me, he says, "Boy," he says, "you know where you're supposed to be?" And I said, "I'll be wherever I want to be." And he got, we came literally toe to toe. And I was ready to go to blows with this man. And thankfully, my girlfriend stepped in between us and said, "Stop, don't," and she broke it up. But shortly after that, I did graduate, and I left for basic training. I had my basic training down in Alabama, and then I went through my AIT in Texas, San Angelo, Texas, to learn my new skill as an intelligence analyst. And I ended up getting sent from there to Fort Riley in Kansas, the 101st Infantry Division. At that point in time when I hit Fort Riley, I was full-blown, now I've got money in my pocket. I don't have a mom and dad. And I really just continued to spiral downhill. I would show up and, do my thing during the day. But then as soon as we were released, it was out on the town, hitting the strip clubs, drinking, smoking. One of the things I did say is when I first went in the military, they asked me, they said, "When was the last time you smoked marijuana?" And I said, "I hadn't," because up to that point I hadn't. They said, "Oh, come on, you've tried marijuana." I said, "No, I haven't. I've drank and I smoked cigarettes, but I never tried." Well, now that I'm in, everybody in the barracks smoked. So at that point in time, I started smoking. Right, like, "Hey, you're smoking a cigarette. Might as well smoke this joint with us." And we pass it around. And so I would did my duties, but then nights and weekends were spent just living it up. And the thing was, I was only 18, 19 years old at the time, and I was just partying like there was no tomorrow. I remember one time going to a party and waking up, passed out in a bathtub. I woke up, and I remember laying in this bathtub, and some girl was sitting on the toilet next to me and said, "Are you having a good time?" And I was thinking, "Yeah, I am." But I used to come home on leave and visit my mother, and it was nice. I would just drive from Kansas to here. I bought my first car. It was a 1965 Mustang Coupe. Loved my 1965 Mustang. Of course, here I'm 19 years old kid. I'm driving 125 down the interstate and living life on the edge at the time. But I come back to town and I find out there's this girl who's moved into my house. My mother, being the kind soul that she is, had taken in one of my sister's friends. And I'm like, well, where's she staying? They're like, she's staying in your bedroom. I'm like, what? Who's this girl who's moved into my bedroom? Now, mind you, I told you my sister was only 2 years younger than me. So as a kid growing up, I used to hit on my sister's girlfriends all the time. I mean, they were only 2 years younger than me. So, you know, I'm like, hey, what's going on? So I'm like, I come back and I'm like, well, you know, who's this girl who's staying at my house, who's living in my old bedroom? My mom's like, well, she was really needed. She'd been kicked out of her house and she needed a place to stay. And so, you know, she's staying here with us. Well, being the young promiscuous adult that I was, I hooked up with this young lady who was now living at my mother's house in my old room. I used to tell a story. They say, you know, how did you meet her? I said, well, I came home one day and she was sleeping in my bed. And that was kind of running a joke I had for a while. But anyway, again, I was living life high on the log, doing whatever I wanted, living life in the fast lane, until one day they called me. I was in the barracks and I get hey, Maddux, you got a phone call. You remember these are pre-cell phone days. You had to call them the landline. Maddux, you got a phone call. So I went over and I picked up the phone, and it was this young lady who'd moved into my mom's house. Her name was Cindy, my new girlfriend, as I referred to her. She was my Pueblo girlfriend. I had my Kansas girlfriends as well. But she calls and I'm like, hey, how's it going? She's like, good, I need to talk to you. And I'm like, okay, what's going on? She's like, well, I'm pregnant. And I'm like, oh, okay. So, like, is it mine? She's like, yes, it's yours. So I told her, I said, maybe you should come out here and let's talk about this. So she said, okay. So she made the drive from here out to Fort Riley in Kansas. And I talked to a buddy of mine who let us, because I was living in the barracks at the time, he let us kind of stay. He had an apartment. He's like, you guys can crash out in the living room while she's here. And so I remember we went out to the bar and we were sitting at the bar having some beers and we were talking about her being pregnant. We both determined that, you know, that abortion wasn't an option, that, you know, we were going to have this baby. And so at that point I said, so since we're going to have this baby, how are we, you know, do you have any insurance? And at the time she was just working a part-time minimum wage job at a restaurant here in Pueblo. And so I said, well, you know, if we get married, you know, the government will take care of all your medical bills and stuff. And she's like, okay, sounds good. So we went to the courthouse in Manhattan, Kansas, and filed paperwork and took a handful of drunk Army buddies and we went to the courtroom in the best shirt I had and the cleanest jeans, and she borrowed a dress from one of the ladies in my unit, and we got married in front of a judge, and they're in Manhattan, Kansas. And so we did end up coming back here. I called my mother and said, hey, we're getting married, we're going to have a baby. And my mother was like, what? I said, yeah, you know, Cindy and I were married. Well, they wanted to have a little party for us, and I remember we actually came and they had a little reception for us here at the Christian Center down in the fireside room, and to celebrate our wedding. But after that, she stayed here. I was getting close to the end of my enlistment, and I'd already made the determination I was not going to re-enlist in the Army. I was going to get out. And so she came back here and stayed and was seeing the doctors here at St. Mary Corwin for her pregnancy. And of course, the Army was paying for it all. And it got down to the end of my enlistment, and I got out of the Army. in the end of May. Moved back here, back into my mother's home, and where my now wife was living, and moved back into my bedroom with my wife, my mother's basement. And about a couple weeks after me getting out, my first son was born over here at St. Mary Corwin. And so I found a job here. Unfortunately, getting out of the Army and being a military intelligence analyst, not too many job opportunities in Pueblo for an intelligence analyst, especially back in the mid-'80s. So I looked around, I found a job working construction, and we found a little house and we moved into, but we really struggled to make, ends meet at that point in time. And my wife at the time, Cindy, her parents were divorced. She had her father lived out in Southern California and her mother lived down in Georgia. And we really struggled to make ends meet here. The economy here in Pueblo, the mill was going through a shutdown, and finding a job here in Pueblo was very difficult. The economy was, I think that was about the same time they came up with PEDCO to try to, the Pueblo Economic Development Corporation, to try to bring some business, because the mill had almost shut down. We had laid off steel workers everywhere, and finding a job in Pueblo was near impossible. And so we went down to Georgia. My wife says, well, let's move to Georgia. My mother can, help us out. And Georgia's, Atlanta's a lot better place to live, and we can find work down there. So we packed up my newborn son. He was only, a couple months old at the time. And we moved down to Georgia and moved in with my mother-in-law. Well, it only took me a few weeks to find out that my mother-in-law was a raging alcoholic. So that arrangement didn't last long. We had a few things that we were able to pawn, and we made a couple dollars at jobs that we had found, and we ended up renting this roach-infested apartment, one-bedroom apartment. We didn't have anything. I remember looking back now, my baby, my infant 2-month-old son, we didn't even have a crib for him. We ended up making a bed out of one of the dresser drawers that we had. We lined it with blankets, and that was his first bed. It was a dresser drawer that we used as a crib for him. But that didn't last for long, and I realized how rough life was trying to live there in Atlanta with no help. And so I called my mother back here in Pueblo. I'm like, Mom, I need you again. And my mother, being the mother that she was, says, come home, I'm here. I'm waiting for you. We'll help you. We'll get you back on your feet. And I said, okay, Mom. And so we packed up, we left Atlanta. We only were down there for a few months. We realized this is not a go. We can't do this. So we made it back here to Pueblo and came in. And at the time, I was still partying a lot. I was still drinking. I was still really heavily into smoking marijuana and drinking excessively. And my dad at that point and I tried to rekindle a relationship with my dad again. Now that I was drinking and smoking and I was a man. And so I went over to his house, and remember we had fun. We would hang out and drink and share a joint together and smoke and get high. And I thought it was all pretty cool. And I remember one day in particular sticks out in my mind. I come home and I was high as a kite and half lit, drank probably a 6-pack of beer, and I walk in and my son had just learned how to walk. And I remember walking in the door and my wife looked up at me and said, look at your son, look what he can do. And I remember him letting go of the coffee table. And he walked over to me, and I remember leaning over to try to pick him up. And I was so drunk and stoned, I almost fell over. But I remember I didn't. I grabbed him, and I remember picking him up and looking into his eyes, and his eyes looking back at mine. And that's when I thought, what kind of a dad am I going to be? What am I going to be to this boy? Am I going to be, and I suddenly looked back at my father and I said, am I going to be just another one of these men? And I made a commitment right then and there. I set my son down and I said, that's it. I'm done. I've got to clean up. I've got to get right. And so I came back. I talked to my mom and I started coming back to church again. I said, Mom, I'm going to start coming back to church. I gotta make it right. I've messed up, and I came to my mother and I said, Mom, I'm sorry. I've done wrong. And she says, don't tell me, son. Tell the Lord. Apologize to God for what you've done. And I remember I came here and I wept on the altars and said, Lord, forgive me for what I've done. I don't want to be my father. I don't want to be this man. I want to love my children. I want to love my boy. I want to be that father that I should be to him. And God is so good. At that time, I got to know a gentleman named Russ Brown, Russ and Mayetta Brown, that used to go to this church. And I remember getting hooked up with Russ. And Russ Brown was such an influence on my life at that point in time because he was such just a godly man. He modeled to me, what I should be. We ended up working together. I got a job here with him. He got a job, and we were working to build a retirement home that I go to now as a paramedic. I walk in the building, I'm like, I built this place. But Russ was just such a blessing to me at that point in my life because I needed a man. I needed a man that would take me under his wing, and show me what it was like to be a man of God. And Russ was that man, and God put him in my life at that point in time, and I thank God every day for him because he taught me what it was to pray. He taught me what it was like to love. He taught me what it was like to truly care for your wife. And I remember Russ and I praying one day, and he asked me about Cindy, and he says, "What about Cindy?" I said, "Well, Cindy doesn't believe in God. If you ask her, she's an atheist. She's like, prove to me that there's a God." And so Russ said, "Well, we're going to start praying about that." And I said, "All right." So I remember he and I used to meet at the altars here, and we would pray. And I remember one time we were praying, and Russ was praying in the Spirit, and he leaned over at me and he says, "Walt," he says, have you ever been baptized in the Spirit?" And I said, "No, I gave my life to the Lord, but no, I've never been filled with the Spirit." He says, "Well, that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to start praying for that." And so I remember praying with him, and we just and I'll never forget being down there at the altar with Russ and him just laying hands on me, and he just talked to me and just said, just let the Spirit. He says, "You feel that?" He says, "Let the Spirit come over you. Just let it fill you." And he says, "Just let it go. Don't hold it back. Let God in. Let him do his work in your life." And God, I just remember that, just that feeling of just that warmth from head to toe when the Spirit just filled me and I started speaking in tongues, and just it was so wonderful. And I remember getting up, and I never felt better. I was just like, this is great. And then that's when Russ says, "Okay," he says, "now we're going to start praying for your wife." And I said, "All right, we're going to pray for her." And so I prayed, and I witnessed, and she'd say, "You know what? You can keep your Jesus stuff. I'm going to do me, you do you." I said, "All right, And so Russ says, we're gonna let God take care of this. You and I, we're gonna pray and we're gonna believe." Well, it happened to come up upon that time again. There's a retreat, couples retreat. Where at? Up at Horn Creek. So I said, Russ is like, we need to go. Get her to go to Horn Creek with us. God's going to move. God's going to move up there. And I said, all right. And I said, I'm going to talk to her. So I went and I presented it to her. I'm like, hey, we're going to do this couple retreat up in the mountains. And she's like, sounds great. I'll go, but don't expect me to do anything. I'm going to go, I'll toboggan, I'll sled, I'll have fun, but don't expect me to be a part of any of your Jesus stuff. I'm like, okay, I just want you to come along and have a good time. And I remember we went up there and man, it was so good. It was so great being back up on that mountain again. And I remember meeting at night in the cafeteria there in the lodge, and Russ and I praying and just binding that spirit of evil that was upon her, and just praying the anointing of God, and that God would just move upon her, Cindy, and that He would show Himself to her in only the way that God could move and do. And it came down. It was the last night. It was snowing up there. And I remember we were sitting there, and there was a big fire in the fireplace. And Pastor Dean, I think, was the one giving the message that night. And he got down to the end, and I turned and I looked, and I could see God was moving. Was moving on her life. And it was so amazing. And I remember her coming down and Pastor Dean saying, if anybody wants to receive the Lord, come. He waits for you. And I remember her getting up and coming down there and us just praying. I was so overfilled with joy of seeing her. And that next morning, again, as we were coming down off the mountain, I reminded me of when I was a kid, of when I came down off that mountain and her singing all the way down the mountain, go tell it on the mountain. And she was like, I just want to stay here. She says, this is so great and so wonderful. And I said, I know, isn't it? This is amazing. God is so good. And, we started coming to church here, and things were really looking pretty good at that point for us. We were still struggling financially. Work was still very, very difficult. We continued to, just kind of struggle here to make ends meet. In the meantime, I started trying to pursue my career of wanting to be a firefighter and a paramedic. And so I had applied at the fire department here, Pueblo Fire Department. I went and I interviewed, I did the test, and I made the list to get on the fire department. And I was very excited for that. And I was hoping, I'm like, here's my chance. I'm going to finally get to become a fireman. I was going to finally get to become a paramedic. And I was so happy. I was so looking forward to it. And life just seemed to be really good at this point. Like, we were struggling. I was working a part-time minimum wage job, but with the help from the church and help from my family, we were getting by. Not high on the hog, but we were surviving. But I went one day and picked up my little check from my job and was driving down Highway 50 towards Bonfort. There was a convenience store, Quickway convenience store up there at Norwood and Highway 50. I was coming down Highway 50 to Bonfort there in my 65 Mustang that I had bought while I was in the Army. And as we came to the red light, I put the brakes on, and all of a sudden my brake pedal went clear to the floor, and and before I knew it, boom, we rear-ended the car. And, thankfully myself, Cindy, my son Doug in the back seat, we were all belted up. He was in a car seat, but it totaled my Mustang. It just destroyed my Mustang. And so we sat there and we're like, well, now what are we going to do? We lost our only transportation, the only car that we had, and the only way to get around. And it's about that time that my wife got in touch with her father, because she hadn't spoke to her father in years and years. And she had her maternal grandmother passed away. And so she managed to get a hold of her dad, and they started conversating. And she ended up, he's like, I'd really like to see you again. And she said, well, I'd like to see you. And so he bought her a plane ticket, and he flew her out to California. And when she came back from California, she came in and started telling me, she says, hey, I think we need to move to California. I said, well, really? She said, yeah. She said, Dad works for General Dynamics. It's a big government contractor. It says he can get you a good job. It's a union job with benefits, good pay. And he says, all we got to do is move to California. I said, well, what do you think? She goes, I think we're struggling. And she says, he's got a car, he's got a truck, he's got a motorcycle. He said we can borrow his car until we can buy a new car. I said, oh, okay. I said, but what about the fire department? She goes, well, you've been waiting for almost a year now and they haven't called you. So I said, okay, well, let's go. So we bought a plane ticket. My father-in-law helped us and we packed up everything we had and we flew out to Southern California. And we got to Southern California and as promised, my father-in-law got me a job working for General Dynamics. I worked the Pomona division. We built the phalanx gun system for the U.S. Navy. Pretty impressive weapons system if you've ever seen it. My wife ended up getting a job working for a photography studio. We were renting a little studio apartment and we were driving my father-in-law's Cadillac around Southern California. Felt like we were living high on the hog, eating In-N-Out and hanging out on the beach. And we felt pretty good about things where life was taking us. We'd even found a church to go to down there. We started attending Chino First Assembly of God Church down in Chino, California. We were living in Ontario. And if you know that area, they're a bunch of cities and they're all real close. So working in Pomona, going to church in Chino, living in Ontario, but they're all literally across the street. You drive across one street and you're into a next town. But life seemed to be going, pretty well for us there. We were getting settled in and we had our jobs, we had our apartment, and we didn't know anybody outside of my father-in-law. My father-in-law was the only person we knew in this metropolis, this suburb of Los Angeles, and we were about halfway between San Bernardino and Los Angeles in what they called the Inland Empire. And we had a neighbor that lived a couple apartments down from us who had a couple school-aged children, and we had my son at the time. He was getting a little bit older, and he was getting about 2 years old at the time. And he was right about 2 years old. And so the neighbor lady said, well, I'll babysit for you. She goes, I've got my 2 young kids. I'm a single mom taking care of my kids. And, they're gone during the school during the day and I'm home alone. I can watch your child. And we're like, cool, that's nice. Appreciate it. She was this nice mother of 2, single lady. Well, things seem to keep going again, like I said, pretty well. And then one day, I get a phone call there at the plant, and it's my wife. It's Cindy, and she's crying. And I'm like, what's wrong? What's wrong? She goes, something's wrong. I came home for lunch, and our apartment door is open. The baby's gone. All of our stuff is gone. We've been robbed. I don't know where Doug is. You need to come home. You need to come home. So I rush home, and I get there, and there's a couple police units there. The officers are taking report, and my wife comes over and she starts crying on my shoulder. And she goes, I don't know where our son is. He's gone. He's gone. And, and I felt so alone at that point, standing there looking around, not knowing where in this large metropolis my son was. But then all of a sudden we turn and we look, and wouldn't you know, coming across the parking lot is the babysitter with our son. And we were like, oh, thank you, Lord. Thank you for returning. I remember my wife ran over and grabbed our son, and the officers went over and grabbed the babysitter. Well, it turns out, like I said, we were robbed. We were robbed by the babysitter. The babysitter had taken our television, my wife's jewelry, camera, DVD player, it wasn't DVD, it was VHS back in those days. Took the VHS player, had pawned it all, and went and shot up on drugs while babysitting our son. She had pawned all of our stuff and shot up. She had fresh track marks on her arm where she had shot up. Well, needless to say, PD took her into custody, and we went back to our empty home, and we had a bed, some dishes, and no television, nothing else. And so my wife ended up having to take the next day off work because we didn't have a babysitter now. And so I went to work the next day, and I remember when I had started work there at General Dynamics, there was this very nice lady that I worked with. She was a coworker, very motherly. She was old enough to be my mom, and I kind of looked towards her. At that point, I was really missing my mom. I had a very close relationship with my mom here. She had raised us, and I was very, very close to my mom. And this lady was kind of filled that mother role for me. She showed me around the plant, had showed me, all the ins and outs, and told me what to do and whatnot. She had kind of taken me under her wing and really had showed me the ropes of the plant. So I came in that next day, and I relayed the story about this, whole fiasco had gone on the day before with this babysitter. And she looked over at me, and she writes down on a piece of paper and hands me a piece of paper, and she said, here's the number to my daughter. You give her a call. She can help you. Her name is Rose. And I said, oh, okay. So I called the number and talked to Rose, and I said, hey, your mother gave me your number, and we're needing somebody to help us out. And Rose said, yeah, I've got 2 kids of my own. I'd be more than happy to help you out. And so I said, oh, I appreciate it. And so we went over and met her, and we hit it off with Rose right away. And so things seemed to get back on track again. We made really good friends with Rose and her boyfriend at the time, and we were all the same age, and so we now had friends, and when we started getting more involved with the church, Chino First Assembly, we got more and more involved, and it was really nice because going to church here, I had Pastor Madsen and Maley, and Madsen I had known since First Assembly of God Church. And I loved Pastor Madsen and Maley here with all of my heart. But I had always put them up on such a high pedestal. They were just these great men. But Pastor Chuck Skaggs was the pastor of Chino First Assembly, and his wife's name was Myrna. We got to know them on a more personal level, and they actually invited us out to dinner and out to lunch after church, and we got to know them on more of a personal level. And it was the first time that I really got to know a pastor, on a personal level, because as a kid growing up in a church, pastors were way up here, and here we were down here, and and it was a great experience for me to get to know Pastor Chuck Skaggs, because I got to know him as a man, and they did so much for us in our Christian walk. They got us involved with the church. Cindy actually started singing. She found she liked to sing, and I remember we used to get the cassettes, and she would get up and she would practice her song, and of course we would sing from the hymnal, and then we'd stop for a special number, and she'd get up there and sing. And I got back there and I started learning how to use the soundboard, because when she would come in and practice singing, I would run the sound system for her while she's like, I'm going to go practice this new song I found. I remember we'd go to the store and she'd buy a new cassette tape, and then we'd have to go practice at the church. And then we started helping. They had some trouble with janitors, and we did janitorial stuff for a while, so we actually ended up with like even keys to the church, because we'd come and we'd vacuum and clean and take out the trash, and we got very, very involved in the church. Well, Cindy got pregnant again, And we were very excited about her second pregnancy. And we ended up having a little girl. And we were excited. We had the perfect family. You know, I had a good job. We were living in Southern California. We found this great church, and you know, we had these new friends, and we'd bought our own car. Now we gave, you know, Dad the Cadillac back, and you know, life was really looking up for us, and things seemed to be really going well for us. After our daughter got old enough, my wife ended up going back to work. And so now we were taking my son Doug and my daughter Kristen over to Rose to watch. And, you know, we went to Rose and we were like, hey, you know, she was so excited. And, you know, Rose loves kids. And she especially loves babies. And so, you know, she was now watching, and life kind of got back to its normal routine again. And one day I left the plant, and I thought, well, I'm going to stop by my wife's work and surprise her and chit-chat with her for a minute before I go over to Rose's house and pick up the kids. And I remember I pulled up to my wife's work, and I went inside and I walked in the door, and as soon as I walked in the door, everybody in the office just stopped and they stared at me. And I was like, what? What's wrong? And one lady finally looked up at me and she says, don't you know? And I said, don't I know what? She says, they've rushed your daughter to the hospital. And I said, what hospital? They told me. And so, of course, you know, I jumped in the car and I drove like crazy to the hospital. And I got to the hospital and I came in and I was in a sheer panic. And I said, I'm here. And they showed me back to the quiet room at the hospital, outside the ER, into the quiet room. And I found my wife there, Cindy, and she was crying. And I held her, and my father-in-law showed up, and the three of us were there in the quiet room. And it didn't seem like it took long. And the doctor came in and said, I'm sorry, we've done everything we could, but, you know, your daughter has died. And I remember we were just devastated. And, you know, we said, why? What happened? And the doctor looked at us and he said, well, it's this thing, it's this newer thing that that they're coming out, they're talking about now. It's called SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, where, you know, the baby's just put down in the crib and, you know, they stop breathing and they just don't start breathing again. They said, of course, you know, this is all preliminary, and, you know, you'll get a full autopsy report later on. And I remember going and picking Doug up from Rose, and Rose was just devastated. And we took Doug and went home, and, you know, we tried to process it all, and we ended up having our daughter flown back here to Pueblo. We wanted her buried here in Pueblo, and we actually had her memorial service here at the Christian Center. We bought a nice little pink casket, and I had a family member give us a plot over here at Mountain View Cemetery, where we went and we had her burial. Her services were done over here at Mountain View. But then, you know, after the services, we ended up going back to California, because that's where our life was, and tried to get life back to normal. The staff and the folks there at Chino First Assembly were very supportive of us. They were very loving, very kind, and really did a lot to try to help us, you know, get through that period of grief. You know, but it was that point in time, I think, that Pastor Skaggs suggested that, you know, Cindy start getting some more professional counseling, because Cindy had dealt with a lot of issues from her childhood that she had never really resolved. She had gone through a lot of physical and sexual abuse as a child, and abandonment issues that she was still trying to work through. And Pastor Skaggs said, hey, I recommend this counselor. And so she started going seeing this counselor. And we seemed to kind of level out a little bit more again. And then she ended up getting pregnant again. And then we had my second son. My second son, Jake, was born. And Rose had gone back to babysitting Doug again. And then when Cindy gave birth to Jake, Rose said, I'll keep watching Doug, but I'm not going to watch another baby. And I remember Cindy and I told Rose, we said, no, we wouldn't trust anybody else with our baby but you. Because we had sat down and we had spent a lot of time, like I said, we had made a friendship with Rose at that point in time. And, we talked to her, and Rose had felt so bad. I mean, she felt as bad as we did over the whole situation. And we told her, there's nothing you did wrong. You did everything right. There was nothing you had done wrong. This is not your fault. And we told her, we trust you. We trust you. We would not trust anybody else with our son, with our baby, but you. And she flat out kept saying, nope, nope, nope. And I remember Cindy, on the day she was going back to work, drove up, and we pulled up and walked in, and Cindy said, here you go. Turned around and says, Rose is like, no, I'm not. She goes, yes, you are. And turned around and just walked away. Well, needless to say, Rose gave in, and she babysat Jake for us. And the friendship continued. And again, things seemed to be kind of going pretty well. We seemed to recover from the loss of our daughter, and then Jake seemed to be doing pretty well, and we had our two boys, and life, we were doing fine. It was about this time I ended up switching jobs. I'd kind of gotten frustrated with where things were going at General Dynamics, and I ended up getting a job for Ethan Allen Furniture, driving a truck, delivering furniture. And I was making good money, but I was gone a lot, and I was on the road quite a bit driving. And I ended up getting Cindy ended up getting pregnant again, and she was probably I don't know, 3 months along, and she ended up miscarrying that baby, and it was after that miscarriage, she seemed to really, I don't know, it was, she was going to counseling, but the counseling didn't seem to be helping her. As a matter of fact, the counseling seemed to be making things even worse. Her problems started to seem to intensify, and these old issues, these old problems were being drug up and with no resolution. So things she had buried was now being brought back to the surface, and our relationship started getting worse. Things at church started to kind of seem to fall away. Things just started to take another nosedive again, and one day I remember coming home, and as I walked in the door after a long day at work, Cindy was standing there with her bags packed. She was standing there with luggage. And I said, what's going on? She says, I'm leaving. I said, well, where are you going? She goes, I don't know, but I've got to get out of here. I can't do this anymore. And I said, okay. She goes, I'm going to go stay with a friend. I said, well, what about the boys? She goes, well, you're going to have to take care of the boys. The boys are yours. You take care of them. And with that, she picked up her bags and she walked out on me. And all of a sudden, I was left standing there in this apartment with my two sons, not knowing what to do or where to go. Well, the economy here in Pueblo had, like I said, taken a tank. Well, my mother, who had remarried, her and my stepdad ended up moving. They left Pueblo. The economy was so bad. He had got a job actually working. He worked construction, my stepdad did. Construction was booming out in Las Vegas. And so they had sold the home and they moved to Las Vegas. And so they were living in Vegas. We'd actually gone and visited them a couple times, made a trip from Southern California up into Vegas. So again, I called my mom. I said, Mom, I need you. I need help. I don't know what to do. And my mother again was like, son, come home. Come home. I'm here. And I said, well, home is Vegas? She goes, yeah. She goes, if you move out here, you can go to work. You know how to do construction. I'll take care of the boys. I said, all right. So we packed our bags and we left Southern California, moved to Las Vegas, and went to work doing construction out there. And Cindy stayed in Southern California. She didn't move. So in the meantime, I had been applying at jobs, like firefighter jobs. I had tried all over Southern California. I tried Los Angeles County, Long Beach, Huntington Beach. I mean, you named it. I still had this desire to be a fireman, to be a paramedic. And I tested and tested and tested. And I couldn't get on anywhere. Nobody would hire me. I would pass and they'd say, oh, you did well. You passed the test, but, I'm sorry, just not this time, not this time. And so when I got to Nevada, I did the same thing. I tested City of Las Vegas, North Las Vegas, Clark County, Henderson, Nevada, still trying to get my job with the fire department. It just kept going nowhere. And so my youngest sister had never got married, and she had continued to live with my parents. So when they moved away from Colorado, she moved with them. My youngest brother, he had gotten married. He had joined the Air Force and left for the military. So when I moved to Las Vegas, it was kind of a family reunion because my mother, my stepdad, and my sister were all there. And so it was very nice because I had my mom and my dad, and we'd kind of buried the hatchet a little bit, I think, between us. I was not so resentful of him anymore. I suddenly was starting to realize, he wasn't that bad of a guy after all. And, he did take very good care of my mother, and he loved her. He wasn't mean and abusive. He was a good man. And we actually worked very close together, got me the job that I had there in Las Vegas doing construction. Well, it was about that time that my sister got diagnosed with cancer. And so she started receiving treatments for her cancer. And in the meantime, while she was getting cancer treatment, my wife and I patched up our differences. We talked and we reconciled. We were separated for probably about 6 months. That she lived in Southern California and I lived in Vegas. We lived separated for about 6 months. And she ended up moving to leaving Southern California and moved to Las Vegas with me. And we got our family back together, but now we were dealing with, my sister and cancer. And my brother got a hardship reassignment, and he ended up getting assigned to Nellis Air Force Base there in Nevada. And so it was kind of nice. We had our family. It was my brother, my sister, myself, my wife, my children, mom and stepdad. We were all there. But we thought we'd had cancer beat. They went and they did the scans, and she went through chemo, and we watched her go through radiation and chemo, which was very, very difficult to watch my little sister go through that. And we thought we'd had it beat. Things were looking up. We were doing good. And, some time went by. The treatments were done. And then one day, she comes back from a checkup, and the doc says, the cancer's back. And it's back worse than it was before. And it had spread, and it had metastasized. And, at the time, I was just a construction worker, and I didn't understand cancer like I do nowadays. But I knew it wasn't good. And so we did the best we could to take care of my sister, and she ended up on hospice care. And it was hard sitting there, watching her just wither away, slowly but surely. And she never married, she never had kids, but she loved being around my boys. She loved being a part of their lives. It was also during that time that my wife got pregnant again, and we gave birth to my third son, my youngest son. And I remember she loved my boys, my sister did. She loved being the auntie to them, and since she had never had kids herself, and she just loved spoiling them and spending time with them, and she was the greatest auntie ever. But as things would have it, one day I was at work, and they were like, Walt, we have a phone call. And I went and took the phone call, and they said, you need to come home. Your sister has died. And I remember coming home and just seeing my mother so wrecked and so sad. Well, she was brought back here and buried as well. My mother had her remains brought back here, and they had a service here in the Christian Center for her. And she was buried in Mountain View Cemetery, not very far from where my daughter was buried. And it's just a row down and a couple graves over that separates their two plots at the cemetery. Well, after my sister's death, my mother handled it. It was very, very hard. She decided that she needed to leave Vegas, so she packed up. Her and my stepdad moved back here to Colorado, which left Cindy and I and my three boys and my brother and his wife and their children there in Vegas. And my wife and I, Cindy and I, talked at that point, and we said, well, do you want to continue living here in Vegas? And both of us decided we don't want to live in Vegas. We don't, because our boys were at age now that they were starting to go to school. The oldest two were actually in school. The youngest, or the middle, my son Jake, was in kindergarten at that point in time. And it was also that point in time that I noticed that Jake, my middle son, started having some issues. And so we took him to be examined, and it turned out that he had epilepsy because he started having seizures. And so we were taking him to the Children's Hospital there in Las Vegas, and they got him on some medication to kind of help control his seizures. But we were at this quandary about what we were going to do. Well, Cindy wanted to move back to Southern California. I wanted to move back to Colorado. I wanted to come back to my family. Well, she came up all of a sudden and told me that she wanted to move to Maryland. And I said, Maryland? Well, it turns out that the counselor, the therapist she had been seeing in Southern California, was doing his internship in California. Well, he was done, and he had went back to Maryland to set up his practice. And she had followed him and realized that he had set up a practice back in Maryland. And so she said, well, if we move to Maryland, I can continue my counseling. So I said, okay. And we couldn't come to agreement because I refused to move back to California. She refused to move to Colorado. So as things would have it, we ended up moving to Maryland, which was very weird because we knew nobody in Maryland. I had no job. I had no place to live. I remember we took our income tax return and we loaded up a trailer with what stuff we could fit in the trailer, hitched it on the back of our car, and took off to Maryland with just, well, we can do this attitude. I had done some research and found a town to live in, and I'd selected the city of Hagerstown to live in. It was close enough to Frederick. Frederick, Maryland was where her counselor was. I said, well, we can't afford to live in Frederick, but we can afford to live in Hagerstown, and it's close enough you can drive to your appointments. So we packed up and we moved to Hagerstown, Maryland. And I remember we pulled into town, first time ever there. We rolled into the city. Neither one of us had been there. And we pulled and we stayed at the Super 8 Motel for probably about a month. We lived in the Super 8 Motel, me and Cindy and the 3 boys. And I remember Jake got real sick and we had to get him checked into the hospital. And turned out to be that he was toxic from his medications. But you know what? I rolled up my sleeves and I went to work. I found a job because I couldn't find an apartment. I tried to find an apartment and they won't rent you an apartment without a job. So I rolled up my sleeves. I found an apartment. I found a job. Got us out of the hotel. And I started working at building our new life in Maryland. I managed to get a job working construction, which I had recent experience with. And I again went and knocked on the door of the local fire department because I was still years down the road wanting that job. I still had that desire inside to be a fireman and a paramedic. And so I knocked on the door of the fire station, and this gentleman answered the door, and I said, hey, I want to apply for the fire department here. And he said, well, come on in. You can fill out an application. And I thought, that's kind of weird, because in the past when I've done this, they sent me down to the government office downtown to see one of the HR personnel, and I'd fill out an interest form, and they'd call me back when they were hiring. And you know, I was used to this big process, having been in Southern California and in Las Vegas with these big metropolitan fire departments, but yet Hagerstown is just a small town. So I thought, okay, whatever. So I went in and I filled out an application. The guy says to me, after I fill it out, he says, well, we'll vote on your application at the next month's board meeting. And I said, you're going to vote on my application? The guy looked at me and goes, yeah. He says, we're a volunteer department. Didn't you know that? And I said, oh, a volunteer department, huh? The guy says, yeah. He says, do you not want to join our volunteer department? Well, at that point in time, the wheels started to click inside my head, and I said, are you guys going to train me to be a fireman? And they said, yeah. I said, you'll give me medical training as well? He says, yeah. He said, we pay for all your training. And it was that point that I realized this is why I had constantly failed, was because I was going up against guys who had experience, who had training. And I realized this was my opportunity to get the training. Yep. So I went through and I joined the fire department and I started going to school. Well, in the meantime, I was still working. I still had to support my family. So at the time, I was working full time, going to school, and volunteering. I was gone constantly from my family because now I was pursuing my career. And unfortunately, being out there in Maryland, we fell farther and farther away from the church. We never found a church there in Hagerstown to go to. And Cindy, now that she was back with this counselor again, seemed to start going downhill again. She had seemed to kind of plateau while she was there in Vegas and she wasn't seeing him. But now that she was seeing this counselor again, she started going downhill again with her mental health, to the point that she was literally on antipsychotic drugs. And we started dealing with suicide attempts. She tried killing herself multiple times. She started getting into self-harm, self-mutilation. She started having issues with personality disorders, where she had these different personalities inside of her. And I had fallen far enough away from the church at that point in time, and I was so focused on me and my career and my goals and what I wanted that I didn't have time for this. So one day I came home and there was this guy who we had befriended that hung out a lot. Well, come to find out one day, I come home and Cindy admits to me that she's having an affair. And so I got very angry again, and I packed up and I moved out. I said, fine. I said, you have your affair. I'm going to move out. And so I've got places to go. So I actually went and I stayed at the fire station. It was a volunteer station, and they had a resident program where you could stay at the fire station as long as you got up at night to run calls. So, I just seemed to fall farther and farther away, and just the depravity of life. And, I was just so consumed with what my desires were, and I hurt, and I wanted to lash out, and I wanted to hurt back. And so I ended up having an affair. I found one of the young EMTs I was working with, took to me, and next thing I know, I was having an affair and sleeping with this lady. And I remember one night this gal I was having an affair with came and saw me at the fire station, and we were in the back of the fire station in each other's arms, and my wife came around the corner and caught us red-handed. And I remember that situation as clear as day. I remember the screaming and the hollering, and her saying, "How could you do this to me?" and storming off, and the girlfriend cussing and hollering back at her, and I told the girlfriend, "Go." I said, I can't do this right now. I can't. I need, and I sent the girlfriend away, and my wife left, and I walked away very confused, going like, now what am I going to do, And that was about that point in time that I remember getting a phone call from my mother, and my mother crying and sobbing and saying, "Son, what are you doing? Who are you? What are you?" She says, "This is not the son I have raised. This is not the child of God that you were meant to be. Why are you acting like this?" And I said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I've done." I said, "Can you forgive me?" And again, my mom says, "It's not me. You have to ask forgiveness, son. Talk to God. Ask God for forgiveness." And I remember kneeling and saying, "Lord, forgive me. I'm sorry. Forgive me for what I've done. Forgive me for my sins." And I just remember God saying, "Okay, I forgive you. Now, you need to go back to where you were. You need to fix your marriage. You need to fix what you've done to your sons. You need to repair, what's been done. You need to, undo the damage that you've done." And so I moved back home, and I worked fervently at repairing my relationship. And about that same time, I ended up getting my first full-time job as a medic. I got my job. I was now working the job I wanted. I had my job that I had dreamed of. I was working hard to put my family back together, to spend time. But with all my work, we still was missing the focus of putting God in the center of things. I was trying to fix it myself now. I was trying to repair the damage on my own, and not seek God in these things. And I figured, well, I can handle it. I look at what I've done. See what I've done this. I came out here all by myself. I had nothing. I've got a nice home. I've got my job. I've had my career. I have all that I want. And I get a phone call and let me know that my grandpa Janetta had passed away. And unfortunately, I regret it to this day. I never took time out. I said, "Oh, sorry, I'm too busy. I can't come." I didn't show up for his funeral. That was in 2000, and it was almost a year exactly later that my grandpa Maddux, my paternal grandfather, died, and I got a phone call from him, not from him, but my dad. My dad called me the year later, 2001, saying, your grandpa has died, and you need to come back to Colorado. We want you to be one of his pallbearers for his funeral. And I said, okay. And it had been a long time, because I had came through Colorado in 1995. That's when we left Las Vegas. So I had been through Colorado in 95 on my way to Maryland, and now it was 2001. And of course, we had all just went through 9/11, which I was a paramedic working the streets on the day of 9/11. And that's another whole story in itself. But my dad says, we need you back here in Colorado for your grandpa's funeral. So I said, all right, Dad, I'll be out there. So I took time out, and I remember I flew out here, and we went down to Alamosa, because that's where my grandfather was buried. That was my family was down there in Alamosa. And we went to his funeral, and I was back here in Pueblo, and I stayed at my mom's, and my wife calls me and says, hey, I need you back here. I said, okay, what's going on? She says, my mother and my father have both ended up in the hospital. Now, remember correctly, my mother-in-law had been living in Atlanta, Georgia, and my father-in-law had been living in Southern California. Well, they both had retired. Now, he was living down in Southern Florida, and she was living in Northern Illinois. I can't explain it, but she's living up there. But anyway, I find out my father-in-law is in ICU down in St. Petersburg, Florida, and my mother-in-law is in ICU in Chicago, Illinois. And my wife is in Maryland saying, I need you back here in Maryland. And here I am in Colorado. I'm like, well, if I can get the flight changed, I'll be there as soon as I can. And I remember I flew in, and we were making arrangements to figure out which parent, because we had one parent in Chicago and one down in St. Petersburg. Well, I had an aunt. My wife's aunt was down in St. Petersburg, Florida. Said, you tend to your mother in Chicago, because there's nobody up there to handle that situation. This was the alcoholic mother-in-law. She was dying of liver failure from her years of alcoholism. And she says, you go up to Chicago, handle business there. I'll take care of business down here in St. Petersburg. So before we could make it to Chicago, they called us and told us, your mother-in-law has passed away. And this was now January of 2002. And so we were like, okay, well, we'll head up there. We'll handle affairs. So we went up to Chicago. We went to my mother-in-law's apartment there. We took care of business. We went by the University of Chicago Hospital. We handled business there. My wife's grandmother still lived here in Pueblo, and she wanted my wife's mother buried here. And so we made arrangements to have her body flown from Chicago back here to Pueblo to be buried, of all places, Mountain View Cemetery, where my sister and my daughter were buried. And so we made the arrangements. Well, while we're up in Chicago, we get a phone call from St. Petersburg saying, your dad has passed away. They literally died within 3 days of each other. So the aunt down in St. Petersburg says, don't worry, I'll take care of business down here. Your father had specific instructions that he wanted to be cremated. Since your mom is having a burial in a casket, take care of that business first. We can always have a ceremony down here in Florida, since it's an urn with the ashes. And so we came back from Chicago to Maryland, and we got there, and I remember Cindy saying, I have got to go to my mother's funeral. I said, we can't go. I don't have any time left. We don't have the money. We can't go. And Cindy looked at me. She says, I have to go. I can't go. I can't miss my mother's funeral. I have to be there. And I begged her. I said, you are not in a state of mind right now to go. And even her doctor, the counselor she had been seeing for so many years, he reiterated the same thing. He's like, you are in no shape to go to your mother's funeral. So despite both of us urging her, she said, I'm going. She got a ticket and she booked a flight. And she says, are you going to drive me or not to the airport? So I called one of the paramedics and I said, hey, can you cover my shift so I can take my wife to the airport? He said, yeah. So I drive her to Baltimore and I give her a kiss. I said, all right, call me when you land in Pueblo or when you land in Colorado Springs. Let me know you're there safe. So I leave, I go back to work. I'm working on the ambulance and I get a phone call that says, I missed my flight. I said, why? She said, this whole security thing. I said, we're post 9/11. Security at the airport's different now. She goes, well, let your mother know my flight has been rerouted. I'll be flying into Dallas instead of Atlanta, and I'll be getting into Colorado Springs a little bit later. I said, okay, I'll let her know. So I called my mom and said, hey, don't pick her up till this time. She said, okay. Well, later on that evening, I get a phone call from Dallas, and I answer it, and I said, can I help you? And I get, this is Dr. So-and-so from Hubert Medical Center here in Dallas, Texas. He says, we have your wife here in the emergency room. I said, what's wrong, doctor? He's like, well, we're hoping you can shed some light. He said, your wife's plane landed here and they couldn't wake her up. We had to call the paramedics to come get her and bring her to the hospital. He says, we've done blood work, EKGs, everything seems to be normal. He said, but she's unresponsive. I said, well, because right now, I said, she's physically, emotionally, spiritually empty. I said, she's exhausted. The doctor says, okay. He says, well, we're going to admit her to ICU and observe her overnight. There's no reason to rush here to Dallas. We'll monitor her. She's stable. We'll let you know if anything changes. I said, okay. The next morning, he calls me. I get a call, and it's the ICU nurse. She says, hey, your wife's awake, wants to talk to you. I talk to her. She says, hey, I need to get out of here. I need to get on to Colorado. I need to be there for my mom's funeral. I said, how are you doing? She says, better. I've got some rest. I was just tired. She said, I fell asleep. The next thing I know, I wake up and I'm in the hospital. So I talked to the doctor. The doctor says, yeah, she's fine. You're right. She's exhausted. She needs to sleep. She needs to eat. She needs to rest.
Wow.
So I had to get a medical clearance for her to get back on the airplane, which the doctor was more than willing to fill out. She got on the airplane and she flew on in to Colorado Springs. I got the phone call, said, hey, I'm with your mom. We're headed to their house. I made it here. I'm going to go by the funeral home. I'm going to see my mom's body at the funeral home, and then I'm going to go home to your mom's. I'm going to eat some dinner and go to bed so I can go to the funeral tomorrow. I said, okay. And I went to bed. Next morning I get up, I go to work. We're actually transporting a patient. I'm driving, and my partner's in the back with a patient, and my phone rings, and I answer it, and it's a roommate we have, and his roommate says, hey, your mother just called the house looking for you. Something's wrong. You need to call your mother. I said, okay. So I hang up, and I call my mother, and when my mother answers the phone, she's sobbing. And I said, Mom, what's wrong? She said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I said, Mom, it's okay. And I knew at that point, I knew in my spirit, in my soul, I knew. I said, Mom, it's all right. Are you doing okay? And she said, I'm sorry. She says, I just went in to wake her up and I found her. And so I told my partner in the back, I said, call, I need relief as soon as we hit destination. And she said, okay. And I said, Mom, stay with me on the phone till the paramedics get there. And she did. And I talked to her and I said, it's going to be all right, Mom. It's going to be all right. Just breathe. And she kept saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I said, it's okay, Mom. It's okay. Got the paramedic on the line. He goes, hi. I said, are you the paramedic? He said, yes, I am. I said, I assume my wife has died. He says, yes, sir. I'm sorry to say your wife is dead. I said, okay. I said, well, please look after my mother. I said, she's got a bad heart. This is her medical conditions. Please look after my mom. He says, we'll take good care of your mom. I said, thank you. So needless to say, I caught another flight back out here to Pueblo. I remember talking to the funeral home, and the funeral home, I talked to him. I'm like, well, is there any way you can save her body till I get there? And they said, well, to save her body, we'll have to embalm her because we can't hold the body that long. And my wife had made specific instructions to not bury her. She made me promise her that when she died, and she had always told me, she says, I will die before you. She made me promise that when she died that I would cremate her. And I said, no, she made me promise to cremate her. So I'll go ahead and cremate her, and she did. And the boys and I flew back here. And again, we were back at the Christian Center again for my wife's funeral service. And I remember them saying, well, what are you going to do with the ashes? And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do with the ashes. And somebody said, well, what about you if you bury him with your daughter? And I said, that's an idea. So I called Mount View Cemetery, and they said, sure, you can bury your wife's ashes. So we had a gravesite service for her as well, and we buried her ashes there. And I ended up talking to Dr. Kramer, who was the coroner here at the time, and he told me, he said, Walt, I want you to know something. He says, I want you to know that your wife did not die of an overdose. I said, okay. He said, I'm putting on the medical death certificate. I have to put something. He says, I'm putting multiple drug ingestion. And he says, I say that because I have to say something. But what I'm saying is your wife's routine medication in her depressed state was enough to push her over into heart failure. She died of heart failure because of her medications. None of her medications were in overdose amounts. I said, okay. because I knew she wanted to be here for that funeral, and I knew she wasn't suicidal, and that's what everybody had thought. Everybody said, well, she was suicidal. I said, no, she wanted to be at that funeral. But anyway, I ended up flying back to Maryland with the boys, and now all of a sudden I'm a single dad taking care of the three boys all by myself in Maryland, and I'm like, what am I going to do here? So again, I called my mother and I said, Mom, what do I do? Mom says, you can come home, son. We're here for you. We love you. And I said, okay. I said, let me pack things up and we'll be home. And so I packed the boys up and we left Maryland. And we moved back here to Colorado and got settled in to our new place, and went back to work, and started, trying to put our life back together again. And I was going to work here in Pueblo, but Pueblo wasn't hiring at the time, so I ended up getting a job working for AMR up in Colorado Springs, and we were still trying to adjust to the fact that my wife had died, because we moved back here. She died in January of 2002, and we moved back here in July of 2002. And I ended up working, because I was the new guy on the block, New Year's Eve up in Colorado Springs. And I had the three boys. I had Jake, who had the seizures, Douglas, who was my oldest, he was 18, and then Devin, my youngest. He never felt comfortable staying at home while I was gone, so he would go stay with Grandma. And so I would leave the two boys at the house. Well, because it was New Year's Eve, Jake had come to me and had said, hey, Dad, can I go spend the night with my friend? I said, sure, I'm going to be at work, and your brother, he's fine staying home by himself. So I went to work, and I worked a weird shift. I got off at like 1 a.m, which turned out to be 2 o'clock because it was New Year's Eve. I didn't get home till almost 3 a.m. And I remember coming into the house, and when I came in, I closed the door, and my oldest son heard me come in, and he came out of the bedroom, and he goes, hey, Dad, how was the night? And I said, oh, it was busy, but, not bad. And we were talking, and we were about ready to go to bed. I said, well, I'm going to go to bed. Well, then I hear the front door open, and I turn and I look, and it's Jake. And I remember I looked at my watch, and I said, what are you doing? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. He said, oh, I couldn't sleep, Dad, so I came home. I said, well, young man, it is 3 a.m. Go get your butt in bed. You need to go to sleep. He goes, all right. So we all said, love you, and the boys went to bed, and I went in and went to bed. Well, my oldest, Doug, told me before he went to bed, he says, don't forget, Dad, I'm going fishing with Grandpa in the morning. I said, oh, that's right. No worries. I said, Jake and I will be fine. So went in and went to bed, and I remember waking up, laying there in bed and looking at the sun and going like, man, the sun's sure bright. And I laid there for a little while, and I started thinking, man, it's quiet out in the living room. It's quiet because the boys were very they were into watching Cartoon Network. Yeah. And I remember I used to always wake up. That's what used to wake me up was the Cartoon Network. I remember yelling at them, turn it down. Your TV's too loud. I'm trying to sleep. But it was really weird this morning. I woke up and it was so quiet. And I got up and I walked out in the living room, and TV wasn't on. There was nobody in the living room. And I thought, wow, I wonder if Jake had got up and went down to his grandma's. So I remember I opened the door and I stepped into the bedroom, and that's when I seen Jake laying on the floor. this story a million times. But, here I am. I'm a seasoned paramedic now. The crazy thing was, the very next day, January 2nd, was supposed to be his 15th birthday. He was turning 15 tomorrow. We had presents for him. I already purchased cake and everything. We were ready to celebrate his birthday. And I remember the paramedic kicked in and I grabbed him and I drug him into the middle of the room. And I started doing CPR on him, because that's what I do. And I was, come on. Live. And after several minutes of doing CPR, I came to him like, he's gone. And I remember stopping and sitting there in the room with him. In the room with him. Let's say, God, why? Why? And I'm just sitting there and I held him. I kissed him. Said, I love you. I love you. So, I gathered myself up and I went and got my phone. I dialed 911 and told him, I said, I need somebody. I need somebody here now. My son's dead. And God, the sound of the sirens were like music to my ears, because somebody was coming. And I remember the first deputy that came through the door. He went back, and then the second one came through, and he looked at me, and I just wrapped my arms around him. And I held him. I couldn't tell you the man's name, but I held him. And I wept on his shoulder. And he just stood there and held me. And the fire department arrived, and the ambulance showed up, and I said, somebody's got to let my family know, because I hadn't called anybody else. All I'd called was 911. And I remember my mother coming down, and my stepdad. The look in their eyes. My youngest son and my oldest son looked at me, and I don't know. I don't know. And so I'll never forget, I stood there. They said, maybe you may want to go. And I said, no. I said, I want to stay here. And I remember them carrying him out in the bag. Then again, I met with Dr. Kramer again. We sat down again, I and Dr. Kramer, and we talked. And he confirmed my worst fear. Jake had a grand mal seizure in the night after we went to bed. He'd had a grand mal seizure and had fallen out of bed. And the way he landed, he ended up just asphyxiating himself. He suffocated himself just by the way he had landed. And that was the cause of death, was asphyxiation. So, here it was. It hadn't even been a year yet since my wife's death. And now we were dealing with the loss of my son. And it was just so hard. And I was struggling so hard. And there's those certain things in life that you never, ever forget. They're burnt into your memory. They're seared in there forever. You never forget them. And I remember my youngest son, Devin, coming to me and looking at me and going, Dad, why did Jake have to die? And that look, the innocent look, that child look into my eyes, and I looked at him. And it was that point that I dug deep and I thought to myself, I said, God, you're going to have to answer this one. I can't. I can't answer this one. I can't. I don't know. I don't know myself. And it was about that time I felt the Spirit of God come upon me. And that time that God gives you the words when you don't have the words, when you don't know what to say, He gives them to you. And I looked at him and I said, son, I said, sometimes when you're outside, you and your brother, and you're playing at the playground. He goes, yeah. And I said, I've got chores or homework for you to do, and I need to call you home to take care of your chores or your homework. And he goes, yeah, Dad. I said, it's just the same. I said, we don't understand why, but God has called your brother home for reasons we don't understand. I said, we're left out here to play a little longer. I said, but soon the day will come and we will all go home and we will join your brother home one of these days and be with him again. And he looked up at me at that point and he understood. He goes, okay, I understand, Dad. I said, okay. And all I could do was I looked up and I said, thank you, Lord. I don't know where that came from, but thank you. I couldn't have answered that upon my own. Now, I have to backtrack here just a little bit and say that when Cindy died and we came back here for her funeral, I made a phone call. And it was to my friend, my good friend, Rose. And I said, Rose, I hate to call you and tell you this. I said, but Cindy has died. Because Rose and Cindy were very good friends back in the day. They were best friends. And I said, she's died. And she said, what? I said, yeah. She says, I'll be out there. And Rose jumped in the car and she drove from California because she was still living there in California. She drove out here and she was here for Cindy's funeral. And I remember she said to me at the time, she says, is there anything you need? I said, no. I said, I'm good. I said, the boys and I are going back to Maryland. I said, we're fine. Thank you for coming out. I appreciate you. She says, I love you guys. You are like family to me. And I said, well, you are to us, and we love you too. And so she ended up going back out to Maryland. And oh God, I remember making that phone call to her, and I said, hey, I hate to call you again. She says, what? I said, I've got bad news. And she said, what? I said, Jake has died. She said, no, I remember. She broke down and she wept. She says, not Jake. I said, yeah. She says, how? I said, I don't know. I said, come. She says, I'll be there. I said, all right. And she was here. She was here. And she was here for his service as well. And at the time, I didn't have the money or the funds to do anything else, so we had him cremated as well. And again, we're back at the Christian Center, another funeral. And I called Mountain View one more time. And I said, Mountain View, I said, do we have room for one more? And Mountain View looks at me and says, yes, but this is it. No more for you. I said, okay, fair enough. No more for me. So we had another service out there at Mountain View Cemetery, and my son's ashes were buried in that same plot. It was such a little plot because my daughter, being a child, there was plenty of room for both my wife and my son's urns in that same plot, but Mountain View said no more. I said, okay, fair enough. I promise you, I won't bring you anymore. But I remember Rose saying to me, she says, I will quit my job and stay here and take care of you and the boys. And I said, no. I said, no, you're married, because she had gotten married by that point in time, and she had her youngest daughter, Tyler, and I said, no, you've got a family, you've got a job, you have a husband back in California. I said, we'll be fine. We'll be fine. I've got my family here, I've got my church here, I'll be fine. And so Rose packed up and moved back and went back to California, and I began to be very mournful. I grieved, and I grieved heavy. I got up, I was functional. I went to work. I didn't turn to alcohol. I didn't turn to drugs. I did turn to food. I began to eat to comfort my pain. And I started to gain a serious amount of weight. My weight ended up getting to be I ended up about 325 pounds. I was very large, and I really struggled with things, and I was trying to work, and I was trying to manage things, and I was not doing what I needed to, and I ended up, at the time, AMR had a contract with the Air Force Academy, and I took a position working the ambulance up at the Air Force Academy, which was a break I needed. And God blessed me with a very good partner who was a Christian. And she used to pray with me, and she used to tell me, she says, Walt, you gotta give it back to God. Quit trying to carry this on your own. And I said, okay, you're right, I need to. And I began to pray, and I spent time, and I said, Lord, I said, I can't carry this on my own. I said, I need you. I need you to be there. And I remember God saying, I'll be there for you. Turn to me, look to me, and I will be there for you. I will be there for you. And I said, and it wasn't till I started just spending some time in prayer and spending time with the Lord again, and just came before Him and started seeking Him, because prior to that, I was trying to solve it on my own. I had started dating again, and which ended up horrible. There were some horrible dating situations and just very bad. And I remember God speaking to me and telling me, He goes, be okay where you are and allow me to do my work. And I had to say, okay, God, I trust you, and I'm going to turn the reins over to you and not try to fix it on my own. He said, let me surrender to me. And I said, okay, Lord, I'm surrendering it all. And at that point in time, I remember releasing it to God and saying, okay, it's yours. And all of a sudden, my eating started getting in order. I started not eating so much. I started working out. My weight started going down. Mentally, I had given it all to God. I said, you know what? I'm going to trust you, Lord, and trust you alone. And if I'm a single man from here on, then it's you and me, God. We got this. I don't need anybody else but you, and we can do this. And I really started to get into a lot better place in my life. And I started, just feeling and knowing I was better, because I was spending more time in God and letting Him handle my problems. And it was about that time my friend Rose called me, because she had just gone through a horrible divorce. And now, mind you, this was years later. This was like I said, Jake died in 2003, and this was 2007. So it was about 4 years had gone by that I was depressed probably for a good couple of years, and it took me a while before I finally started to turn to God and accept. So anyway, I started talking to Rose on the phone, and she was crying, and so her and I started talking and praying together over the phone and saying, God will help you and will help you get through this. And I remember we ended a phone conversation because she was newly divorced. She was a single mom taking care of her daughter again. And I remember her hanging up the phone saying, I love you. And I said, I love you too. And she goes, no, I love you. And I hung up the phone because this was the first time I'm like, whoa, that was a little weird coming from my friend Rose. So then I call her back, and I remember calling her back and I'm like, so what's with this love thing? And she says, I love you. And I said, I love you too. I said, but I don't want to lose our friendship. I value the friendship you and I have. I said, you are my best friend. You have been beside me. I mean, you have been a friend, the confidant for years through all the troubles I have. And she says, well, you've been there for me. And I said, I know. And so she said, well, what about if I come visit? I said, okay, come visit. I said, if it's not right, it's not right. And she said, okay. And I remember I went and I met her at the Colorado Springs airport, and she walked off the airplane. And I thought to myself, I'm going to give her a kiss. And if it's like kissing my sister, then it's not going to work. And so as she walked off, I walked up to her and I kissed her. And it was right. It was right. And so we had a great week together, and we realized that we could be together, and there was just something about the relationship that felt just right. There was something about it that just said, this is it. And I prayed, and God gave me affirmation in my heart and said, yeah, this is it. And a few months later, she ended up going back to California, and we kept talking, and we said, we can't do this long distance relationship thing. She's like, how about if I move out to Colorado with you? I said, well, if you want to leave California and move to Colorado, you can. So she did, but we made a promise to each other, and we said we'll put off the formal wedding because we had kids graduating high school, and I said we'll wait till the kids graduate, and then after we graduate the kids, then we'll get married. And life seemed to be, doing pretty well at that point again. I was back at a point where I was doing well again. And but then the news came that my mother had cancer. And I remember her going through the treatment, and we thought about stepping the wedding up so Mom could be there, but she was just, the cancer and the chemo was just too hard on her. And, I remember Rose was right there beside me through the whole thing. We sat there and we watched her, and I remember her sitting there and holding her hands, and I remember Mom looking up. This woman, the woman who had given me the example, for me, she was God in the flesh. I mean, she had shown me, she had been that example of what Christ-like was like, what it was like, because every time something had gone wrong, every time I had gone out and tried to do something and screwed it up royally, she would say, welcome home, son, and welcome me back with open arms and with love, and show me and say, your God is the same way. Turn to Him. Return to God. Tell Him what you tell me, because your God will never leave you. He will never forsake you. He loves you. And I remember sitting there holding her hand and just praying with her as she went to be with God. It was so surreal. But, it was, it was tough. I mean, it was losing her. It was very, very rough, But I thank God that, that He had put Rose in my life and that the two of us, we're together now. And, we went, I lost her in 2011. And, Rose and I, we had a couple more losses. I lost that next year, 2012. I lost my paternal grandmother to cancer. And then in 2015, I lost my step-grandfather to suicide. Because after my grandmother died, he was never born again. He just went to drinking and ended up killing himself. And 2015 is when my grandma Janetta died at 102. And that was 2000. And then 2016 is when Rose's brother died. It was our 5th wedding anniversary in 5 years that my mother had died. And Rose lost her brother. And she really, really struggled with that. And, and her and I we'd been praying, we'd spending time in the Word, but we had not really devoted ourselves back to the church, and being faithful, being a part of the body. We were trying to, be good Christians on our own and study the Word at our own and be at home on our own. And that's when Rose said, we need to go back to church. We need to start going back to church. And I said, well, what church do you want to go back to? And she goes, well, what do you think? I said, well, Christian Center has always been home for me. I said, that's always been family. And so when we ended up praying about it, and, we prayed and said, Lord, what do you want? Right. And we came here and we started attending. And I remember coming and talking to Josh because God had been putting a call on my life to be a chaplain. Mm-hmm. And I had tried to dodge that a few times. And, I remember when I finally said, okay, Lord, and I feel like that, I feel sometimes like so much like the prodigal son, but then, I remember reading, we just went over it the other night in class with Pastor Josh, James, chapter 1, verse 23, where it says, if a man reads the word and then doesn't do what it says, it's like a man who looks in the mirror at his face and then walks away and forgets what he looks like. And those words have spoken so much to me because I feel like that's where I had been, where I kept looking at the word and looking at the word, and as soon as I'd turn away, I'd forget. But I thank God that He always was there to welcome me with open arms and never just say, I love you, son. Yeah. Welcome home. And all I'd have to do is, I'm sorry, Father, I've sinned, forgive me. And He would welcome me back into His arms. And my mother and grandmother showed me that in so many ways. I can't thank God enough for the blessing of a godly grandmother and a godly mom who not only just taught me the Word, but showed me, lived the Word every day. They demonstrated love to me in every way you can. But, I came to God and then I drifted away, and I came to God and I drifted away. But God is so forgiving, and God is so loving. And even though we make mistakes and we screw up, He's there ready for us. He's waiting for us with open arms for when we say, I'm sorry, Father, I've sinned. Forgive me. And when we come back with a broken heart, a contrite heart, and say, God, forgive me, I have sinned against you. He welcomes us back into His arms and says, I just love you. And I'm just, I come back this time with such a renewed, fresh And I thank God for the blessings that He's given me. I am so blessed. I'm married now to a wonderful, God-fearing woman who loves the Lord with all of her heart. I have 5 kids, counting my kid. I have 11 grandkids. I'm blessed. I have a wonderful job. I have a wonderful home. You know, I mean, you look to Him, you trust, you put your faith back when God said, trust me, put everything you have in me, and I'll take care of you if you'll just trust me, give it to me. Don't do it on your own, because you can't. When you do it on your own, you make a mess. You know, God is so good, and He's so forgiving, and that's, I want to give that. I want to give that forgiving, that loving, that just say, God is there. Doesn't matter what you've done. He'll forgive you. All you have to do is turn back to God and say, Lord, I've made a mess. Forgive me. Come back. And He will open His arms and welcome you. He says, for what is dead is now alive. What is lost has now been found. And He'll celebrate your return. It's so good. God is so good. I just, you know, and I don't know what else to put on that other than I'm blessed. God is good. You know, I've been through stuff, but God has never left me. God has never forsaken me. I have been through some hard stuff. I have been through pain, but through it all, through the ups, through the downs, even the times when I wasn't following Him faithfully, He was there. He was there with me. Those times that I cried out and said, God, where are you? He was there to comfort me. He was there to say, I'm right here, son. I am right here. And even though my father wasn't a perfect father, he showed me what a good father is and what a good father should be. And I thank Him for that. I thank God for being that father and for being that father to me. I thank the men of this church, the good, godly men that are in this church, because I need that. You know, I've lost, you know, all my grandparents are gone. My father's gone. And it helps me to see these godly men here. And I love that Tuesday morning men's group. I love coming and hanging out with those old guys. It does my heart so much good to be with those men. It blesses me, and it blesses me to be a part of this church. And the pastoral staff here is, I love you guys, and I couldn't. God is so good. He's been here. He's been a part of this church from day one, from the moment I've stepped into this church, and the different pastors and the people that have come and gone. God has been here, and He has lived and been this. This has been His house, and you just know it when you walk in here and you feel His presence. And like I told Rose, Pueblo Christian Center has always been my home. Always will be my home. I grew up here. This is home. I never plan on leaving here ever again. This is it. This is me. This is my home. I love this place, and I love the people here. God never left me through all of the difficulties, through all of the hard times when I felt the most alone and I cried out. He was there. And that, God, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He means that, and He is. And as a good father, He loves you. He loves us. And He just wants to be with us, and He wants us to be with Him. That is His heart's desire, is for us to be with Him. And all He wants is, son, come to me. I'm here. I love you. I'll be here for you. There's nothing but love, and I love my God. Yeah. He's always just been so good to me. And I don't blame him. I don't blame him for anything at any point. Some people say, well, aren't you? No, I don't. I don't. My God has had nothing but love for me. He has cared for me. He has comforted me. He has been there for me in all of the hard times, in all the times where I have not known what to do. He's got my back. So, and every morning I wake up and I thank God. I do. I thank God every day I wake up. I say, Lord, thank you. Thank you for another day. Thank you for another glorious day. Thank you for the blessings that you've given me. Like when I sit down and I pray, and I know I feel rhetorical sometimes, but I can't say thank you enough. Because God has been so good to me. God has blessed me so well. And, what can you say to somebody who has loved you in such a way? Thank you is not enough. You truly, the sacrifice of yourself and your life is nominal compared to what you owe. It's so minimal. You owe him everything because he's given you everything. And that love that he gives you is it's amazing. And I'm grateful for it because, again, I've learned firsthand, you can't take anything for granted. You can't take anything for granted because you never know. From the kiss I gave my wife at the airport, I didn't know I'd never see her again. To when I told my son, go get your butt in bed. I never knew I wouldn't see him again. For me, it's so real, And so and you'll hear me when I talk to people, I tell everybody, I love you. And I do, because people, I think, need to hear that, They need to hear, I love you. Because we need to be that body of Christ, because people need to hear that they're loved and they're cared for. From the bad example that my dad set before me, I made a promise. I said, I will not treat my kids the way my father treated me, to bruise. We had welts, bruises. Yeah. But, I mended things with him. I told him, I said, Dad, I forgive you. Right. I forgive you for what you did. Mm-hmm. And he cried and he said, I'm sorry, son. I said, it's, you got to have that, you can't carry that burden and expect to live free. That's not a burden you need to carry. So, as a paramedic, I've seen so many people. And now I'm working as a chaplain, and I'm responding to homes of people, who just died, And so I come in and I have to deal with these families, and I talk to them, and it's like I remember I know I hurt for the ones that don't know God. Mm-hmm. I'm like, how can you even begin to process this when you don't know God? Yeah. With just I don't get how people could do that. For me, it was hard enough having God in my life. But to not have the Lord in your life and to deal with that, how can that be done? I don't get how people can do that and not have a relationship with God. You see why they get angry, why they turn to alcohol, why they turn to drugs, why they become so bitter and evil and just because they lack the hope there is in Christ. Christ gives us that hope. And without the hope, what is there? There's nothing without the hope that our Lord and Savior gives us. Our faith is built on nothing less, and that's like when, Jesus knows the pain, with at the death of Lazarus, how he wept. He knows pain, and he gets it, and he knows us. And that's why as a father, he just stretches out his arms, says, come here, my son, come here. If we'll just turn to him, he's there for us, waiting.